Sometimes, the deepest pain doesn't come from shouting matches or direct insults. It comes from silence. From an unexpected envelope left in the mailbox, words printed in elegant type, wrapped in polite formality, but with an aching, deafening absence of warmth. This kind of pain doesn't announce its arrival. It just appears one day and changes everything. For Catherine, that was how it began, one single envelope, thin paper and gold ink, but carrying the crushing weight of a silent rupture. Catherine had always done everything for her son. She cut back on expenses, put her own dreams on hold, sold heirloom jewelry when tuition needed to be paid. Like so many mothers, she believed love was enough to keep bonds strong, even if time passed, even if he built a life of his own. But there's a difference between moving forward and leaving someone behind. And no one warns you when you've stopped being welcome. It's often the absence itself that shouts it in your ear. This story isn't about bitterness. It isn't about revenge. It's about liberation. It's about the exact moment when a woman realizes that sacrifice has turned into obligation, that love has turned into a debt, and that humiliation has crossed far beyond the line of what can be endured. We're about to dive into a real story layered with emotion, steeped in brave decisions, and built on an independence earned through pain, but carried with dignity. If you've ever felt like a burden in the life of someone who was supposed to value you, this story is for you. If you've ever given up your own dreams for someone who later made a cruel joke about your presence, Catherine might be the mirror you didn't know you needed. Prepare yourself, this narrative will strike deep. Because this isn't only Catherine's story. It's the story of every woman who's been pushed to the bottom, yet decided to swim to the surface and stay there. But before we go further, one question: how many times have you accepted less than you deserve, believing it was just part of love? The answer might be hidden somewhere in a quiet corner of your heart, and perhaps, by the end of this story, you'll finally set it free. Catherine never expected grand surprises. Her modest routine, black coffee in a chipped mug, stacks of books piled beside the bed, was her comfort zone. But that late afternoon, something shattered her predictable rhythm. When she opened her mailbox, sifting through overdue bills and political flyers, she found a thick envelope, decorated with gold detailing. It was far too beautiful to be ordinary. She unfolded the stiff, scented paper, letting her eyes run over the formal words. Ryan Richardson and Barbara Whitmore cordially invite you. An unexpected invitation, direct, impersonal, as if she were a distant acquaintance, not the mother of the groom. Her heart sped up. There had been no phone call beforehand, no conversation, no shared moment of joy. It was the kind of news a mother expects to hear from her son's own lips, not from a piece of paper. The formality of it felt almost like a cold warning, an unspoken reminder you're invited, but only as one of many. No mention of being part of the process. No shared happiness. No place in the planning. It hurt more than she wanted to admit. Her stomach sank heavy, as if she'd swallowed something spoiled. The envelope was beautiful, but its silent message was devastating: you are not part of this. Her mind spun between memories and possible excuses. Had he thought she wouldn't care? That she wouldn't want to be part of it? How could anyone believe that of a woman who had always been there, even when there was nothing to give? She had sacrificed vacations, skipped celebrations, traded nights of rest for extra shifts, all so Ryan could have a dignified life. And now, all she received in return was a beautifully printed sheet of paper, full of polite words but hiding a cruel truth, a gesture dressed up as courtesy, but dripping with distance. It was the kind of invitation that included your name but not your heart. A gesture polite enough to avoid criticism, yet so far removed from sincerity that it almost stung to touch it. Catherine sat on the couch and stared at the letter lying on the table. The silence in her home seemed to amplify the sound of her heartbeat. On that paper was a breaking point, a crack that might never be repaired. And the most painful part was knowing it hadn't happened by accident. It had been deliberate, thought out, planned. Excluding her from the process, the planning, the decisions. This wasn't just logistics. It was a symbolic act of distance. Catherine wasn't just an unexpected guest. She was an inconvenient reminder. A presence that didn't fit in an environment where status and appearances spoke louder than affection. She read the invitation again, searching between the lines for anything that might give her hope, maybe a handwritten note, a personal touch, something that would suggest she was still loved. There was nothing. The text was cold, printed by an expensive press, impersonal right down to the last period. And that hurt more than any argument could have. A mother doesn't expect perfection from her child, but she does expect to be included, to be valued, to at least be remembered as an important part of his life. What Catherine had been given was a calculated Cartesian entry ticket that, in reality, said come, but stay in your place. It was in that moment she understood something had shifted. This wasn't just about the wedding. It was about how Ryan now saw her not as the woman who had sheltered and protected him, but as a secondary figure, misplaced, almost a social liability. The sting of exclusion felt like a slap. There was no need for shouting or open aggression. Contempt has a way of showing itself in silences, in absences, in carefully chosen gestures. And this invitation was the first piece in a very painful puzzle, one she feared would soon come together. Even so, she tried to explain it away. Maybe he was just too busy. Maybe Barbara had handled everything herself. Catherine still searched for reasons that might dull the pain. It's the instinct of someone who loves to justify the unjustifiable, just to keep the connection alive. But deep down, she already knew. This wasn't an accident. It was the opening act of a scene where she no longer had a place of honor. The unexpected invitation was just the first warning, a sign that what came next would not only be uncomfortable, but revealing. Catherine took a deep breath. She knew she had to respond, to take a stand. But something told her she needed to go to see with her own eyes what her heart was already beginning to suspect. She didn't yet realize it, but that day marked the beginning of her liberation. An invitation that looked like it sealed a celebration, but in truth, marked the start of a fracture. And there, staring at that envelope sealed with wax and designed to look noble, Catherine understood. Sometimes, contempt comes wrapped in luxury. And the deepest wound of all is realizing the invitation to your own exclusion is signed by the person you loved most. As soon as she steadied her breath and felt the ground back beneath her feet, Catherine did what any mother in her place would do: reached for the phone and dialed her son's number. The call rang longer than it should have, each beep stretching the weight of her uncertainty. When Ryan finally answered, his voice was brisk, distracted, almost businesslike. Without circling around the point, she asked why she had received the invitation in such a cold, distant way. The answer poured over her like ice water. "Mom, I just need you to be there, okay? Wear something appropriate. We don't want to make Barbara's family uncomfortable." That single sentence echoed like a verdict. As if she were a problem to be managed, rather than a mother to be celebrated. It was as though her presence needed to be controlled, kept in check, almost hidden from view. Catherine had never imagined that, after years of sacrifice, she would become a source of embarrassment to her own child. What did that even mean? That her simple ways were shameful? That her history built on resilience, self-reliance, and survival didn't fit the Whitmore standard of refinement? Every word Ryan spoke felt like a cruel reminder that, in his eyes, social image outweighed the woman who had raised him. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. But it left behind a scar that no amount of time could erase. The sting of humiliation settled over her like a fine dust that refuses to be swept away, no matter how many times you try. Catherine's mind wandered back to the years she had kept the household afloat on her own. When her husband walked away, she had no choice but to carry the weight: rent, food, school fees, medical appointments. Always without complaint, always with a smile she sometimes had to force. And now, she was being asked not to embarrass the bride's family. Was that truly what she was to him now? A social risk? A mismatched piece in the porcelain tableau Barbara had curated to impress her world? But like any woman who has learned to survive without applause, Catherine didn't argue. She swallowed her tears, masked her anger, and replied with a quiet, "Of course, dear. I'll be there." It was a simple sentence, but loaded with a silent irony. Because deep down, She knew this wasn't about a dress code. It was about being excluded from the planning, from the joy, from the narrative itself. She hadn't been consulted about the venue, the ceremony, not even the date. Shed found out about it all at the same time as a casual acquaintance would. The groom's own mother reduced to the role of a spectator. In the theater of her son's life, she had lost her place in the spotlight. In the days that followed, Catherine lived inside a storm of emotions. At times, she caught herself quietly crying while preparing dinner. Other times, she would let out a short, ironic laugh at the absurdity of it all. How could she be so important in certain moments, like when Ryan called in a panic because he needed help paying for his car repairs, and yet so utterly disposable in others? It was as if her worth existed only when it was convenient for him. And this realization carried the bitter taste of contempt, subtle, polite, but devastating at its core. She began to think back on all the moments she'd been left out. The family gatherings where Barbara barely looked at her. The photos on social media where Catherine was never included. It all made sense now. She wasn't part of her son's official life. She was like the small print at the bottom of a page, present, but easy to ignore. And the cruelest part was realizing that Ryan allowed this distance, maybe even agreed with it. It was as though he felt shame about his roots, shame about who Catherine was. Even so, she refused to let resentment consume her. Catherine wasn't the type to wallow in self-pity, but she couldn't ignore the truth staring her in the face. She'd been invited to the wedding as a matter of protocol, not as someone whose presence truly mattered. And when a mother sees that clearly, something inside her shifts. Pain turns into clarity. Clarity turns into a decision. And that decision becomes a road with no way back. She didn't know exactly what she would do yet, but she could feel something moving inside her, a spark of autonomy, of liberation beginning to glow. As the wedding day crept closer, Catherine realized she needed to go, not for him, but for herself. She needed to see, with her own eyes, the truth she had been avoiding. That love doesn't always return in equal measure. That sacrifice is not always recognized. And that sometimes, the only way to free yourself from exclusion is to face it head-on. She would still attend the wedding. But she would not be the same woman who had received that invitation. She was someone awakening, someone ready for whatever came next. Catherine had never been vain in the traditional sense. Her wardrobe consisted of classic piece-well-kept clothes that had lasted her years. The beauty salon was a luxury she allowed herself only on very special occasions. But after receiving that invitation, and especially after hearing the unspoken instruction to dress appropriately, something inside her shifted. She didn't want to show up looking like an inconvenience. She didn't want to give the Whitmore family even the smallest reason to feel embarrassed by her. For the first time in a long while, she decided to place herself at the center of her own efforts. She went over her finances, cut out small indulgences, postponed household repairs, and quietly set aside a bit of money. Her goal was clear: to stand in that room without feeling she had to apologize for existing. For weeks, she walked past store windows, studying the dresses with the care of someone choosing a rare jewel. None of them felt right. Many were far too flashy, others much too plain. Then she saw a deep emerald green dress, made of fluid, elegant fabric that seemed as though it had been designed just for her. The price was steep, almost reckless for her budget, but she didn't hesitate. She bought it using the credit card she kept for emergencies. To many people, it was just a dress. To Catherine, it was a statement, a quiet act of defiance in the face of contempt. An armor against exclusion. Next came her hair. She called the hairdresser she hadn't seen in years, booked an appointment, listened to suggestions, and let them create a discreet, sophisticated style for her. Sitting in that salon chair, surrounded by mirrors and the scent of expensive products, Catherine felt a flicker of guilt quickly replaced by something she hadn't felt in years, a spark of self-esteem. For the first time since receiving that cold, impersonal invitation, she looked in the mirror and saw a woman who respected herself. A woman who, despite everything, still took pride in who she was. The sacrifices she had made to fit into that event were not only financial, they were emotional, silent, and required courage. During this process, Catherine began to see her choices for Ryan more clearly. Every time she had set aside her own wants, every quiet compromise, every dream delayed. She remembered the beach trip she cancelled when he needed to pay for an extra prep course. The new sofa that became a stack of textbooks instead. The wedding ring she sold to cover medical bills. The list was long, and none of those moments carried regret, only a hidden ache, the ache of realizing how invisible those gestures had been to the person who had benefited most from them. Even so, she didn't let herself sink into bitterness. If the wedding was going to be a stage where she was treated as a background character, then at the very least, she would show up with dignity. The elegance wasn't meant to impress Barbara or the wealthy guests, it was for her. It was her way of honoring every effort she had made up to that day. It was her silent way of saying, I was here. I was part of this, whether you admit it or not. By then, the idea of independence had started to take on a new meaning for her. Not just financial independence, but emotional independence. Belonging, she realized, would now be her choice, not a favor granted by someone else. On the eve of the wedding, Catherine carefully pressed the emerald green dress, letting the steam rise in soft clouds as she moved the iron slowly over the fabric. Her hands worked methodically, but her mind was elsewhere, playing and replaying the scene she was about to face. She pictured the grand entrance into the country club, the scrutinizing glances, the whispered comments she might not fully hear but would certainly feel. She also imagined how she wanted to feel in that moment, grounded, dignified, unshaken. She decided right then she would not allow their disregard to make her feel small. She refused to be reduced to the cliché of the simple mother of the groom who didn't belong. Catherine was more than that. She was a woman who had rebuilt herself countless times, without applause, without a safety net. And now, in this carefully curated environment where appearances reigned supreme, she would choose to carry herself with grace even if, deep down, every step hurt. Sacrifice, she realized, wasn't only about giving things up for someone else. Sometimes, it was about holding your head high until the strength you're pretending to have becomes real. She fastened a pair of small pearl earrings and heirloom from her grandmother and slipped on understated shoes that complemented the dress without drawing attention. When she looked at her reflection one last time, she saw the familiar wrinkles, the faint weariness in her eyes, but also something new. A light. A sense of autonomy she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, she was dressing for herself, not to please, not to justify her place, but to occupy a space that had not been offered to her with love, yet would be taken by her with poise. She hung the dress neatly on the door, placed her ID, lipstick, and a small wallet into her bag, and set it by the chair. The preparations were done, but the real change had already taken place inside her. Whatever happened at that wedding, Catherine knew this much: the sacrifices she had made to get there would not be in vain. Even if no one noticed. Even if they laughed behind her back. Even if her presence was pushed into the farthest, dimmest corners of the celebration. Because something inside her had already shifted. And after that day, she would never be the same. The next morning, the sky was bright and cloudless, but Catherine felt as if she were carrying a private storm on her back. The taxi arrived right on time at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She stepped in slowly, holding the emerald green dress with one hand to keep from stepping on the hem. Her shoes pinched slightly, but she walked with steady determination because that day, more than just being present, she needed to appear whole. As the car approached the gates of the country club, her chest tightened. The place belonged to another world entirely: perfectly manicured lawns, marble fountains, luxury cars lined up as if for display. Catherine drew in a deep breath. She had made it there. And that, in itself, was already an act of courage. As she stepped into the reception hall, the contrast between her essence and the atmosphere hit her like a cold wave. Everything around her was immaculate, curated, quiet in the way that only the wealthiest spaces can be, an almost sacred hush, like a luxury library where every sound feels too loud. The guests moved with that particular ease that comes from never having to worry about belonging. Catherine walked with measured steps, her eyes absorbing every detail: the framed oil paintings on the walls, the silver trays carried by uniformed waiters, the scent of expensive flowers mingling with polished wood. It felt like stepping into the glossy pages of a magazine. But ironically, she felt like a torn-out page someone had mistakenly tucked inside. Still, she kept her posture. Shoulders back, chin steady, gaze calm. Because no matter how hard they tried to push her toward the edges of the room, she knew exactly who she was. At the check-in desk, the receptionist asked her name, then led her down a flower-lined corridor to a reserved space where guests were gathering before the ceremony began. No one met her eyes. Some offered polite nods, others glanced briefly before looking away. She recognized two of Barbara's uncles, who studied her with that subtle, evaluating look as if trying to place where she came from and whether she fit in. It was clear she wasn't part of their circle. But Catherine had already decided she wasn't there to please anyone. She was there to be presento mark her place, silently but firmly, in a moment she had earned through decades of sacrifice and endurance. Even so, the sideways glances were impossible to ignore. Her emerald dress seemed to glow too brightly among a sea of beige, champagne, and muted pastels. She found a seat on one of the side armchairs, close enough to watch but far enough to be overlooked. From there, she overheard two hushed comments about the groom's mother and how different she was from the rest. It stung, but it didn't surprise her. She had already understood that in this room, she was an outsider. And this wasn't about style or fashion, it was about class. About the kind of exclusion that is never spoken aloud, but is felt in your bones. Every little detail in that place whispered the same truth: you don't belong here. The ceremony began right on time. An usher guided Catherine to her seat, a side row, well away from the altar. From there, she could see everything, but it felt more like she was watching a scene she had no part in, as though she were just a curious neighbor peeking in. She watched her son walk in, smiling, his arm linked with Barbara's mother. Barbara herself was radiant, dressed in a gown fit for an awards ceremony, and Ryan looked at her with open admiration. Not once did his eyes search for Catherine in the crowd. Not a single glance. Not even the brief acknowledgement that a son gives his mother on the most important day of his life. It wasn't forgetfulness, she could feel it in her bones. It was a choice. The absence of that moment, that connection, was the heaviest blow of the day. No nod. No smile. Nothing but silence. Surrounded by flowers and perfectly rehearsed speeches, Catherine sat still, realizing that invisibility can hurt far more than any cruel word. The contrast between her life and the world in front of her was as sharp as the difference between champagne and tap water. She thought of the months she'd gone without gas service to save money. Of the reheated meals she'd made stretch into 2 or 3 nights. Of the shoes she'd had repaired again and again to make them last another season. And now, there she was surrounded by crystal glasses and polished silverware, feeling like a survivor dressed as a guest. The distance between sacrifice and privilege had never seemed so wide. But instead of breaking her, it reminded her she hadn't come this far by accident or by anyone's generosity. She had earned her place in life the hard way. And no one, not even her own son, could take that truth from her. Even as the silent humiliation pressed against her, Catherine refused to crumble. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't let their rejection define her worth. If Ryan had decided to push her to the margins of his life, that was a burden he would carry, not her. Because her presence, even ignored, was a statement of strength. And somewhere deep inside, something new was beginning to grow, stronger than bitterness, more solid than pain. It was a kind of emotional independence she had never known before. And from this moment on, it would only grow. When the ceremony ended and the guests began making their way toward the reception hall, Catherine rose slowly, her heart heavy but her face calm. She knew the evening still held moments that would test her, and she braced herself for them. The reception hall was even more extravagant than the ceremony space. Crystal chandeliers dripped light from the high ceilings, casting a golden glow over tables adorned with flawless floral arrangements. Everything sparkled, every detail polished, every element designed to impress. Catherine stepped inside quietly, taking it all in with a mixture of awe and discomfort. She knew she hadn't come to be celebrated, but she hadn't expected to be made to feel so peripheral. She approached the seating chart with a small knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Her eyes scanned the elegant calligraphy until she found Ither name, printed neatly under table 18. It was one of the last tables listed. When she reached it, the truth landed with even greater weight. Table 18 was tucked in the far back corner, right beside the kitchen door. The air carried the scent of detergent and frying oil. Every time the door swung open, a waiter rushed past with trays, barely avoiding bumping into the guests seated there. Catherine looked around. The only people at her table were two of Barbara's distant cousins, strangers to her, one scrolling endlessly on his phone and the other already halfway through his third glass of wine. No one from Ryan's side of the family was near her. No familiar face in sight. The message was impossible to miss. She had been pushed to the farthest edge literally and figuratively. She forced herself to maintain her composure. Her son's voice echoed in her mind where something appropriate. Here she was flawlessly dressed, perfectly polished and completely invisible. What no one in that glittering room knew was that being there had cost her dearly. She had sold an old necklace her father's gift-o-pay for her hair appointment. She had declined invitations from friends just to save every possible cent. And still, in this room of abundance, she was treated like an outsider. Her story didn't fit the narrative Barbara wanted the world to see. While glasses clinked and speeches echoed warmly across the hall, Catherine could barely hear what was being said. The music was loud, but her table was too far from the dance floor to feel part of the celebration. It was as though she were watching it all through a pane of glass present, but locked out. The party was for the others. For the ones deemed important. For those worth being seen. Once again, she found herself alone not for lack of company, but for lack of belonging. When she tried to stand and move closer to the festivities, one of the event organizers, polite yet firm, suggested, "Guests at table 18, please remain in your seats until dinner service begins." That was the moment Catherine understood it wasn't just about seating arrangements. It was control. It was about ensuring certain presences didn't disturb the perfection of the spectacle. Her presence was one of those. She wasn't just being excluded. She was being contained. As if the simple act of moving around could somehow ruin the picture-perfect image they wanted to project. It was more than contempt, it was an attempt to erase her. Sitting there in that back corner, Catherine's mind began to drift through the memories of all the times she had been pushed aside in life. When her ex-husband walked out, leaving her with bills stacked on the kitchen table and a child to raise alone. When she worked double shifts, only to be met with judgmental glances for being a single mother. When she quietly endured nights of exhaustion, so her son could sleep peacefully and dream without worry. But this time was different. Because the person pushing her to the sidelines wasn't a stranger, or society, or circumstance. It was her own son. And that was a pain without a name, mix of humiliation, sadness, and disbelief that knotted in her chest. How could someone who had been raised with so much love now feel ashamed of the very person who gave him everything? How could the boy whose scraped knees she had bandaged, whose dreams she had fought for, now see her as a liability? Even so, Catherine didn't cry. Not a single tear. Because in that heavy silence, she found something more valuable than any polite smile or superficial kindness: clarity. The realization that sometimes, freedom only comes when you've been pushed to your absolute limit. When you're forced to see without illusions that there's no longer a place for you in certain spaces. And right there, at the farthest table in the room, Catherine began to rise inside herself. Yes, a part of her was dying in that moment. But another part was being born. And this new part would never again accept being pushed into a corner. Dinner hadn't even been served yet, but Catherine had already digested the true message of the evening. It was simple, and it was final: you are not welcome. The irony was that, in accepting this truth, she finally began to feel free. Because the deepest pain isn't being excluded, it's clinging to places that stopped wanting you long ago. Catherine was never the kind of woman to feel intimidated by her surroundings. But in that hall, where even the glances seemed choreographed to match the luxury, she noticed something strange. She wasn't simply being excluded, she was being ranked. There was an invisible hierarchy, but one that was precise, almost scientific, silently organizing guests according to prestige, last name, and bank balance. Barbara's parents were at the center, surrounded by businessmen, attorneys, and names that sounded as though they had been plucked straight from society pages. The tables closest to the stage were more coveted than New Year's Eve invitations to exclusive resorts. From table 18, Catherine watched it all unfold as if she were studying a rare species in its natural habitat, an elite so selective that belonging wasn't merely a matter of relation, but of presentation. Every toast in the center of the hall felt rehearsed, with glasses lifted in the same rhythm. The same jokes repeated among the same people. One specific laugh echoed louder, always followed by discreet applause. Catherine realized that this reception wasn't about celebrating love. It was about displaying status. A dance of appearances where every detail from the type of flower on the table to the wine being served said who you were. And in the logic of that environment, she was a number outside the equation. Her presence was accepted, but never valued. She also noticed how the service differed depending on the table. The waiters served the highlights first. Hot plates, generous portions, broad smiles. The farther the tables were from the center, the colder the plates, the warmer the drinks, the more impatient the looks. Catherine's table was served last. And even then, the waiter seemed in a hurry. No care, no gesture of delicacy. The hierarchy manifested itself even in the temperature of the dinner. And that said much more about that environment than any beautiful speech ever could. As she looked around, Catherine began to clearly understand the role she had been assigned. She wasn't just the groom's mother. She was the simple mother. The one who was supposed to be content with watching from a distance. Who didn't fit the profile of Ryan's new family. And the cruelest part was realizing that he not only knew it, he accepted it, perhaps even agreed with it. Her absence from the center of the party wasn't accidental. It was strategic. For everything to look perfect, she had to be in the background. She remembered the words she had heard on the phone, wear something appropriate. That wasn't advice. It was an instruction. Almost a threat. Because in that environment, dressing well wasn't about elegance. It was about not causing embarrassment. Catherine was beginning to understand that her exclusion had started long before the invitation. It was in the dinners where Barbara ignored her. In the decisions made without consulting her. In the gifts that arrived by mail, without notes, without affection. The party was only the peak of an old process, the process of making her invisible. Even surrounded by strangers, Catherine felt more lucid than ever. The reception wasn't meant to celebrate. It was meant to position. And she had been positioned with precision far from the dance floor, the official photo, the spotlight. The message was clear: you are part of the past. We, here in the center, represent the future. But a future built on exclusion is fragile. And Catherine, even seated among pots and dirty dishes, already sensed this. Those who push someone to the back often forget that strong roots also grow there. Between one cold bite and another, she thought about the times she had tried to please. The times she brought homemade desserts to try to fit in. The messages she left unanswered. Now everything made sense. She hadn't failed in trying to get closer. They had simply never wanted her to belong. And the most liberating part of all this was realizing that she no longer needed to insist. That the humiliation she endured was not a reflection of who she was, but of who they worked so hard to appear to be. That night, Catherine found no place among the important ones. But she found something even more valuable, the awareness of her worth. Even pushed to the back, she remained firm. And in that back corner, where the light didn't reach and the noise was softer, she began to hear her own voice. And that voice was saying something new. Perhaps this was the end of an era. And the beginning of another, where no one else would define her place. The plate arrived almost 40 minutes late. Catherine already knew it would be like that. The waiters passed her table with a haste that bordered on contempt. When they finally set the plate down in front of her, the filet mignon was tough, the mashed potatoes already with a cold crust on top. There was no decorative sauce, no sign of the same care seen at the main tables. It was food served with the rush of someone eager to end an obligation. Catherine stared at the plate for a few seconds, not because of its appearance, but because of its symbolism. It was yet another reminder of where she stood at the end of the line, on the edge of affection, at the bottom of consideration. Even with an empty stomach, she hesitated. The dry mouth, the smell of lukewarm food, everything added to a discomfort that went beyond hunger. It was as if every element of that night conspired to reinforce her sense of exclusion. Laughter continued to echo from the center of the hall. The cheerful toasts, the camera flashes, the spontaneous dances. But none of it reached her. Catherine was in a social limbo, where the sounds came muffled and emotions seemed forbidden. That table was the territory of the forgotten, or worse, the inconvenient. It was in that atmosphere that the cruel joke happened. Ryan approached casually, accompanied by a few well-dressed friends, glasses in hand and self-assured smiles. He looked at his mother, let his eyes fall on her plate, and in a joking tone said, "At least you're used to it, right, Mom? Eating what life leaves behind." There was a pause. And then, laughter. They laughed loudly. They laughed without restraint. As if it were the best joke of the night. Catherine didn't laugh. She simply looked at her son, without blinking, with a tightness in her chest that no beautiful dress could hide. The phrase lingered in the air, reverberating like a public insult disguised as humor. This wasn't just about food. It was about identity. About reducing an entire life of effort, sacrifice, and love to a tasteless joke. It was the kind of humiliation that clings to your skin. Catherine felt her cheeks burn, but she said nothing. She knew that if she responded, they would claim it was just a joke. That she was being too sensitive. But inside her, a decision was beginning to take shape. A silent certainty this would be the last time. She remembered when Ryan was little and she would cut her own dinner in half so he could have enough to eat. When she made up stories to distract him from overdue bills. When she sold truffles on the street and still came home with a smile on her face. And now, that same boy, grown into a man, was making jokes about her being leftovers. The pain wasn't just emotional. It was physical. As if they had ripped a piece out of her. As if the son she had raised with so much love had been replaced by someone who saw her only as an embarrassment. The night went on, but for Catherine, everything felt frozen. The sound of the music was just noise. The lights, blinding. Every laugh now felt suspicious. Every glance, a judgment. She felt unprotected, exposed, as if her entire story had been stripped bare in front of everyone. The joke wasn't forgotten. It echoed between forks and glasses, between smiles and dance steps. It was an open wound in the middle of the wedding hall. Even so, Catherine remained seated. With posture. With dignity. Because no matter how public the humiliation had been, she wouldn't let it define her. Inside her, something new was rising, a strength shaped by contempt. And she was beginning to understand that independence wouldn't come from apologies, it would come from the decision to no longer submit. That night would not be remembered by her as her son's wedding. It would be remembered as the day she looked in the mirror metaphorically and said, "Enough." Because there are jokes that don't amuse. There are gestures that cannot be undone. And there are breaks that need no words, only a new choice. The traditional Mother Ranson dance was one of the most anticipated moments of the evening, at least at the weddings Catherine knew. Even after everything, she still held on to the hope that Ryan would reach out his hand, call her name, and lead her to the dance floor. After all, she was the only mother he had. It didn't have to be grand or emotional. It just needed to be real. But as the music began to play and the lights turned to the center, Catherine saw another scene unfold. Ryan danced with Barbara, then with his mother-in-law. The guests applauded. And she, sitting next to the kitchen table, wasn't even looked at. There was no invitation. Not even a glance that included her. Catherine watched the steps, the laughter, the spins to the sound of a slow song, and understood that this silence was the definitive answer. The dance, which had always been a symbol of connection, had now become the symbol of a break. He didn't need to say that he didn't consider her part of that moment. It was clear. The gesture of exclusion was subtle, but powerful. And while everyone celebrated, she experienced the grief of a relationship breaking into pieces, right there in the middle of a brightly lit hall. The lights swirled, cell phones recorded, toasts echoed all around. But for Catherine, it all felt like a movie in slow motion, only with the sound cut out. It was as if the world around her had lost its color. The absence of that dance was more than a choice. It was a silent scream. A form of disdain wrapped in indifference. Because real pain doesn't always come with shouting. Sometimes, it arrives like this disguised as omission. And Catherine felt that, in that exact moment, something inside her was disconnecting forever. She didn't need speeches, a public apology, or elaborate explanations. All she needed was that gesture. A gesture that would confirm that, despite the mistakes and the difficult past, she was still essential. That her story still mattered. But when even that was denied to her, liberation took its final form. Not as revenge, not as revolt, but as a peaceful decision. There, among dance steps that didn't include her, Catherine decided she would never again fight for a place where she wasn't recognized. The dance floor looked like a stage, and she, like an extra who had forgotten to be told she had no scene. And, surprisingly, there was no more pain. Only emptiness. A clean hollow where expectation used to be. And in that space, a new thought emerged: if she wasn't part of that show, maybe it was time to set up her own stage. One where there would be respect, where the invitation wouldn't be just a courtesy, but a true celebration. Where her story would be honored, not merely tolerated. While the couple received applause and photos were taken, Catherine remained in her chair, head held high and eyes alert. There were no more tears. Only a growing certainty. That lost dance symbolized something much bigger: the end of an illusion. Ryan had chosen his path. And with it, a new way of positioning himself in the world. Catherine would also choose hers. But unlike her son, she wouldn't exclude anyone. She would simply walk away from those who had long since pushed her out. That night, Catherine understood the true meaning of autonomy. It wasn't about doing everything alone. It was about choosing where to spend her emotional energy. And right there, she decided she would no longer spend anything trying to belong to the life of someone who treated her like an obligation. She didn't dance with her son, but she danced with the truth. And, as harsh as it was, that dance set her free. When the last chords played and the crowd returned to applauding, Catherine simply smiled discreetly. Because in that absence, she had found her presence. And that presence would be the starting point for what was to come: a definitive break, but also a new life. The day after the wedding, Catherine woke up early. She had slept little, but there was no tiredness, there was clarity. She sat at the kitchen table, opened her old laptop, and took a deep breath. The house was silent, as if it respected that moment. It was time to write the email she had been drafting in her mind for weeks. But now, every word would come with precision. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with the firmness of someone who had already understood that trying to belong where there is no space is a form of emotional slavery. This would be an email of breaking ties. Not of ending maternal love, but of ending emotional and financial dependence. She began with something direct: Ryan, I hope this email finds you well. There was no irony, but there was also no longer that blind sweetness. Catherine got straight to the point. She said she saw and felt everything at the wedding. That she understood the place she had been given. That she didn't expect flowers or a red carpet, but she also didn't deserve humiliation disguised as formality. She was honest. She told him how invisible she had felt, how the absence of the dance and the cruel joke had been the final drops in a glass that had been overflowing for a long time. It wasn't a request for an explanation. It was a statement of closure. The hardest part came right after Catherine revealed the sacrifices she had made. She told him about the dress paid for with her emergency credit card, the hairstyle financed by selling a family heirloom, the months of cutting small luxuries to keep supporting Ryan. She explained clearly that much of his comfort had come from decisions she had made in silence, from helping with rent to contributing during moments of crisis. Every penny was soaked in sacrifice. And now, she was deciding to stop this cycle. Not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. In the email, Catherine announced the sale of the house. She said that, for many years, that home had been the center of her life and that even her dreams had been postponed to keep it running. But now, selling it meant more than changing addresses. It meant cutting a bond that had long been corroded. With the money, she planned to reorganize her life. Not as Ryan's mother, but as a woman. With autonomy, with independence. It was time to build a space just for herself, where she would be welcome every day, without needing to fit in or disguise who she was. She ended the message firmly but kindly. She wished the couple happiness. She said she hoped they would build something beautiful, even without her presence. And she made it clear that she was not walking away out of hurt, but out of sanity. Because continuing to sustain someone emotionally and financially who treated her like a burden would be to agree with her own exclusion. She deserved more than that. It was a choice of liberation. To leave behind not a mother's love, but the dependence that had made her accept less than she deserved. When she clicked send, Catherine felt a wave of relief, followed by a strange peace. There was no drama, no regret, only a sense of duty fulfilled. It was like closing the door to a house that had collapsed not with sadness, but with maturity. The new life was still a mystery, but she knew this was the first step. And as painful as it was the most necessary step of her life so far. That afternoon, she began packing boxes. Old photos, keepsakes, stored clothes. Each item stirred a piece of memory. But now, instead of feeding nostalgia, she felt lightness. As if she were clearing not only the house, but her soul. Each box was a confirmation the past had been important, but the future needed space to be born. And this future would no longer have room for humiliation or disdain. She was building her own freedom. By the end of the day, Catherine looked at herself in the mirror and, for the first time in a long while, saw someone at peace. Someone who, even after a story marked by sacrifice, exclusion, and rupture, had chosen to move forward. Because life is too short to insist on places that diminish us. And long enough to start over, even at 50, even alone. In that email, she hadn't just closed a chapter. She had opened the path for a rebirth. 2 months after the wedding, Catherine was almost ready to move. The house sale was going well, the paperwork was in its final stage, and the idea of a new life was beginning to take shape. Then the unexpected happened. Barbara showed up. Without warning, without making an appointment, she knocked on the door with a rehearsed smile and an expression that mixed concern with restrained arrogance. Catherine hesitated for a second, but opened the door. She wanted to hear what the new Mrs. Richardson had to say. She knew that visit wasn't driven by affection. It was strategy. And she was ready. Barbara stepped in, complimenting the house as if trying to create empathy, but Catherine could see beyond the courtesy. They sat in the living room, each holding a cup of coffee. The air was tense. Barbara didn't take long to get to the point. She talked about misunderstandings, about confusing moments at the wedding. She said Ryan was embarrassed about the email, but that deep down, he had only been poorly guided. She stated that Catherine was important to the family structure and that the relationship needed repairs. It was at that moment Catherine knew for sure this conversation wasn't about remorse. It was about need. With elegance, Barbara touched on the key point: finances. "You know how the start of married life can be complicated," she said, with the tone of someone trying to seem fragile. She mentioned unexpected debts, wedding expenses, and a possible struggle with the rent for their new apartment. The attempt was clear to reopen the flow of financial help Catherine had cut off. But now, she was no longer the same woman willing to sustain the comfort of those who discarded her. The implicit proposal sounded like a new form of disdain, the idea that she could still be useful, even if unwanted. Catherine smiled faintly. Not with irony, but with firmness. She said she understood the difficulties of starting a marriage. She herself had gone through that, alone, with a child in her arms and overdue bills on the table. But there was a difference: she had never relied on help from someone who had humiliated her. She explained that selling the house was a process of liberation, and that with this new beginning came the decision to live with autonomy. There was no longer room to be the source others turned to only when their own well had run dry. Now, she was the source for herself. Barbara tried to change tactics. She spoke of reconnecting, of building a new stage in the relationship. She said Ryan missed his mother. But the words felt empty. Catherine knew how to distinguish nostalgia from convenience. If there had truly been regret, it would have come earlier. It would have come with a sincere apology, with concrete actions. Not through his wife, not under financial pressure. This was a negotiation, and Catherine was no longer part of emotional bargains. Not after everything she had lived through at that wedding reception. Catherine calmly stood up, signaling that the conversation was coming to an end. She said she wished the couple the very best. That she genuinely hoped for a prosperous future for them. But from that moment on, their relationship would be based solely on respect, not on favors, not on forced ties. She reinforced that her decision was final. That she would not go back. Not out of pride, but out of dignity. And dignity, once reclaimed, is not up for negotiation. Barbara left the house with the same smile she had brought, but with heavier eyes. Catherine, on the other hand, sat back down in her now almost empty living room. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Because when you finally free yourself from the guilt of saying no, the world starts to turn on the right axis. She knew Ryan would still try to make contact. But it was already clear this was no longer about forgiveness or resentment. It was about starting over. A restart without emotional debt. And in that moment, Catherine had the confirmation that she had made the right choice. Selling the house was more than a transaction. It was a symbolic break with everything that had kept her from living for herself. And no matter how much they tried to negotiate her return, her decision was set in stone. Because she had finally understood love can be unconditional, but respect must be mutual. Catherine arrived in Savannah with 2 suitcases, a simple plan, and a heart ready to begin again. The city, with its historic charm, felt made for fresh starts. She rented a small apartment above an old bookstore, where the creak of the wooden floors became the soundtrack of her new life. There was no luxury, but there was freedom. For the first time in decades, she lived in a place entirely her own, with no demands, no expectations. Just space, silence, and autonomy. She soon found work in the bookstore, helping customers, arranging shelves, losing herself in stories. There, among novels and biographies, she began to rediscover herself: solitary walks, coffee in large mugs, afternoons spent reading. The noise of life faded, and she started hearing what truly mattered. Savannah became more than a setting, it was a symbol of belonging to herself. She made new friends who knew her simply as Catherine, not as Ryan's mother. She joined reading groups, visited museums, traveled alone to nearby towns. Every choice made for her own joy, not obligation, was a victory. After years of living for others, she had learned to say yes to what lifted her and no to what diminished her. When she saw Ryan across the street, she knew the cycle had to close. He approached with tired eyes, speaking of regret, marital troubles, and financial strain. Beneath his words, she heard not recognition, but need. She didn't confront or humiliate him. She listened, then said quietly, "I still love you, Ryan, but not in the same way. Some bridges, once burned with contempt, cannot be rebuilt with apologies." It wasn't about bitterness, it was self-protection. Her days of being a safe harbor only for others were over. Now she was the ship, sailing by her own choice. Ryan tried to insist, but she was clear her door was for visits, not emergencies. If he wanted a new relationship, he'd have to rebuild it from scratch, with actions, not promises. Watching him walk away in silence, she felt a relief no forced reconciliation could give. The refusal wasn't the end of love, it was the beginning of peace. How many times have you sacrificed your dreams for someone who didn't even remember your effort? How often have you accepted less, thinking it was love, or part of the role you were given? Catherine's story is more than a confession, it's a mirror. A reminder that you don't need to wait for a cold invitation, a cruel joke, or a dance that never comes to see you're being pushed to the back. Life doesn't wait for those who settle for crumbs, it rewards those who choose themselves. That takes no anger or drama. It takes clarity, self-respect, and a decision. Maybe you're reading this with a heavy heart, thinking of someone who only seeks you when they need something. That's okay. Recognizing it is the first step to turning pain into strength. Catherine started over. New city. New home. New choices. You can too at 30, 50, or 70. It's never too late to stop carrying a weight that was never yours to bear. So ask yourself, is there a relationship draining you, making you feel small, putting you last? Maybe today is the day to write your own goodbye letter. Maybe today is the day to take your first step toward your own Savannah, whatever that may be. And if this story touched you, helped you see something you'd been hiding inside, then like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Here, we share stories that heal, awaken, and set you free. Because, in the end, you deserve to be the center of your own life.